You missed a spot, the teenage boy shouted through the rolled-down Lamborghini window just before dirty rainwater exploded across Naomi Carter's blue scrubs. The splash hit hard enough to soak her from shoulder to knee, icy street water mixed with oil streaks and grit from the curb splattering across her chest, her sneakers, even the hospital ID badge hanging from her neck. For half a second, downtown Charlotte seemed to stop breathing. A valet near the hotel entrance froze with his hand still gripping a luggage cart. Two women under the awning lowered their coffee cups in stunned silence. Somewhere behind Naomi, a crosswalk signal beeped steadily through the rain like a slow mechanical heartbeat. Ethan Whitmore leaned halfway out the passenger side window laughing so hard he slapped the dashboard with one hand. 17 years old, perfect white teeth, expensive haircut, varsity jacket thrown carelessly over a black designer hoodie. The kind of boy who had never once been told no, and believed the world existed mostly for his entertainment. The matte black Lamborghini idled beside the curb, engine rumbling low beneath the storm clouds while rain tapped softly against the windshield in silver streaks. Naomi stood completely still. Water dripped from the edge of her jaw onto the sidewalk. Her dark curls clung damp against her forehead. The cold seeped through her scrubs almost instantly after a 12-hour overnight shift at Mercy General Hospital. She had spent the entire night helping patients through flu season overflow, surviving on stale vending machine crackers and burnt coffee that tasted faintly like pennies. Her lower back ached. Her feet burned inside worn nursing shoes. And now dirty water slid slowly down her skin while strangers stared. Then the rear passenger door opened. Richard Whitmore stepped out beneath the glow of the hotel awning, adjusting the cuff of his tailored gray coat like none of this mattered. Mid-50s. Sharp jawline. Silver at the temples. The kind of billionaire businessman whose face appeared on magazines beside headlines about luxury developments and private golf resorts. He glanced once at Naomi, then at his son still laughing inside the car. Instead of anger, a small amused smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Jesus, Ethan, he muttered with a chuckle. At least try not to soak the whole sidewalk. Ethan laughed harder. Naomi watched the father and son for a long moment without speaking. Rainwater rolled off her fingertips. A city bus thundered past behind her, spraying mist into the cold morning air. Richard finally reached into his coat pocket and pulled out several crisp $100 bills. Here, he said casually, extending the money toward her without meeting her eyes. Get yourself cleaned up. The valet looked away immediately. One of the women under the awning shifted uncomfortably. Naomi stared at the bills but made no move to take them. The rain softened around them, quieter now, almost delicate against the pavement. Ethan smirked from inside the car, expecting either gratitude or anger. Those were the reactions people usually gave his family. But Naomi only lifted one trembling hand and slowly unclipped her soaked hospital badge from her chest before wiping muddy water from the plastic cover with the edge of her sleeve. Her voice, when it finally came, was calm enough to cut through the sound of traffic. One day, she said softly, looking directly at Richard instead of Ethan, your son's going to learn that humiliating people costs more than money. The smile faded from Richard Whitmore's face almost instantly. Not completely. Just enough. A tiny shift around the eyes. Flicker. Like something cold had brushed past him too quickly to understand. Ethan rolled his eyes. Dad, come on, he muttered. She's being dramatic. But Naomi had already stepped back toward the curb. Water dripped from the edge of her scrubs onto the wet concrete, while the smell of rain, gasoline, and distant coffee drifted through the gray morning air. Across the street, unnoticed by everyone except a young girl holding a phone beneath a red umbrella, the entire moment had been captured on video. And before the Whitmores disappeared into the glass towers of the hotel, that video was already uploading itself into the world. By the time Naomi Carter stepped through the sliding doors of Mercy General Hospital, the rain had followed her inside in tiny droplets clinging to the edge of her sleeves and curls. The automatic doors hissed shut behind her, sealing away the cold city noise and replacing it with the familiar rhythm of overhead intercoms, rolling gurney wheels, and the distant steady beeping of heart monitors somewhere down the east corridor. The smell hit her instantly too. Bleach, coffee, hand sanitizer, warm recycled air. Home in a strange, exhausting kind of way. She moved quietly through the emergency department lobby, her soaked sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished tile floor while exhausted visitors stared down at phones or slept folded awkwardly in plastic chairs. Nobody here cared about billionaires or sports cars. Pain flattened everybody into the same shape eventually. Naomi reached the nurse's station and set down her clipboard carefully beside a half-empty cup of cold coffee someone had abandoned hours ago. Sandra, the charge nurse finishing her morning shift, looked up and frowned immediately. "Lord, Naomi, what happened to you?" Naomi glanced down at the muddy stain still streaked across her scrubs. "Bad timing. Rich kid. Big puddle." Sandra shook her head slowly under the harsh fluorescent lights. "People are something else." Naomi forced a tired smile but said nothing. Her shoulders still felt heavy from the morning, not just from the rainwater drying stiff against her skin but from the look on Richard Whitmore's face after she spoke. It lingered in her mind longer than Ethan's laughter did. Not anger. Something stranger. Like embarrassment trying to hide itself. She pushed the thought away and reached for a fresh set of gloves. A trauma alert buzzed overhead before she could finish clocking in. Instantly the emergency department shifted gears. Nurses straightened. A respiratory tech jogged past carrying equipment. Someone shouted for room 3 to be cleared immediately. Naomi grabbed a tablet and moved fast down the hallway, the rubber soles of her shoes squeaking softly beneath the bright white lights. Through the ambulance bay doors came a blur of movement. Paramedics wheeling in a young girl no older than 12 wrapped in a gray cashmere blanket, oxygen tubing beneath her nose. Her face looked pale against the blanket, freckles scattered lightly across cheeks drained of color. A man walked tightly beside the stretcher, one hand clenched so hard around his phone his knuckles had gone white. Tailored gray coat. Silver at the temples. Richard Whitmore. Naomi stopped for half a heartbeat. So did he. The noise around them seemed to dull for one strange suspended second while recognition landed between them like a dropped piece of glass. Richard's eyes moved from Naomi's face down to the fresh navy scrubs she had changed into 20 minutes earlier. The amusement from the sidewalk was gone now. Completely gone. Fear had replaced it. Real fear. Chest pain started 30 minutes ago. One paramedic reported quickly while moving the stretcher down the corridor. Patient became dizzy during breakfast. History of cardiac complications noted by family. The young girl turned her head weakly toward Naomi as they rolled past. Her voice came out small and shaky beneath the oxygen tube. "Dad." Richard leaned closer instantly. "I am right here, Lily." Naomi looked at the child carefully while adjusting the 4-line hanging beside the stretcher. Lily Whitmore's fingers trembled slightly against the blanket. Not dramatic. Subtle. But enough. Fear lived differently inside children. Quieter. Naomi softened her voice without even thinking about it. "Hey sweetheart, you are okay. We are going to take good care of you." Lily looked directly at her then. Something in the girl's breathing eased just a little. Richard noticed it too. His eyes flicked toward Naomi again, but this time there was no superiority left in them at all. Only exhaustion. And something that looked dangerously close to shame. The cardiac observation room glowed with soft amber monitor lights, and the pale blue reflection of rain sliding down the tall hospital windows. Outside, the storm still lingered over Charlotte, turning the city's skyline into a blur of silver and glass. But inside room 12 everything felt strangely small. Controlled. Fragile. Naomi adjusted the blanket around Lily Whitmore's shoulders, while the heart monitor beside the bed beeped in steady quiet intervals. The girl looked exhausted now, her breathing calmer after medication and fluids, freckles standing out against skin still too pale for Naomi's comfort. Richard stood near the far wall with one hand resting against his mouth, his expensive coat folded over a chair nearby. Without it, he somehow looked less like the man from the sidewalk and more like a father who had not slept properly in weeks. Naomi could feel his eyes on her every few seconds, uncertain and heavy, but she focused on Lily instead. "You like drawing?" Naomi asked gently after noticing the sketchbook resting near the bed tray. Lily gave a small nod. "Mostly horses," she whispered. Her voice sounded thin from exhaustion. Naomi smiled softly. "Horses are hard to draw. The legs always come out weird." That earned the smallest flicker of a grin from the girl. Tiny. Quick. But enough to change the entire atmosphere of the room. Richard noticed immediately. His shoulders loosened for the first time since arriving. A doctor entered a moment later carrying a tablet beneath one arm. Dr. Marcus Levin, mid-40s, calm voice, wire-rimmed glasses always sliding slightly down his nose. Naomi had worked enough shifts with him to know he rarely showed emotion unless something serious was wrong. He greeted Richard quietly before reviewing Lily's chart under the glow of the monitor light. Her blood pressure is stabilizing, he explained carefully. But I still want additional imaging and cardiac enzyme panels before we rule anything out. Richard nodded once. Whatever she needs. Ethan finally appeared in the doorway then, rain still damp across the shoulders of his hoodie. The swagger from earlier that morning was gone now, replaced by the uncomfortable stiffness of someone walking into a room where guilt had arrived before him. His eyes landed on Naomi almost instantly before darting away again. How is she? He asked quietly. Lily turned her head toward him. You came. Ethan forced a smile and moved closer to the bed. Of course I came. Naomi stepped back slightly, giving the family space while checking the medication chart clipped near the monitor. Ethan glanced toward her again, unable to fully hide the recognition burning in his face now. He remembered the puddle, the laughter, the soaked scrubs. But inside the hospital room, none of that seemed to fit anymore beside the steady machine beeps and the smell of antiseptic hanging in the warm air. Naomi was no longer just a stranger from the sidewalk. She was the person calming his little sister with a voice softer than anything else in the room. You work here full-time? Ethan finally asked awkwardly. Naomi kept her attention on the chart. Most weeks. That is a lot of hours, right? She nodded once. Usually 12-hour shifts. Sometimes more. Ethan looked down at the floor after that. Richard watched the exchange in silence, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Shame moved differently through adults. Slower. Heavier. Dr. Levin cleared his throat while reviewing the latest lab results on the screen. His expression changed for only half a second, but Naomi caught it immediately. A tiny pause. Eyes narrowing slightly. Fingers stopping against the tablet. Something was bothering him. Naomi stepped closer beside him instinctively and glanced toward the numbers flashing across Lily's chart. Then her stomach tightened. One medication dosage listed in the intake notes did not match the allergy warning buried farther down in the system. It was subtle, easy to miss, but not harmless. Naomi looked back toward Lily sleeping quietly beneath the blanket while rain whispered softly against the hospital windows. And suddenly the room did not feel calm anymore. Doctor, wait. Naomi's voice was not loud, but it cut cleanly through the soft machine beeps inside room 12. Dr. Levin paused beside the monitor, tablet still in his hand, while Richard looked up immediately from the corner chair. Even Ethan turned from the window where rain streaked the glass in crooked silver lines across the city skyline. Naomi stepped closer to the chart, her eyes scanning the medication list one more time to make certain her instincts were right. Years of overnight shifts had taught her something important about hospitals. The dangerous mistakes were rarely dramatic. They were quiet, buried in paperwork, hidden behind exhaustion and rushed typing in overloaded emergency rooms. She pointed carefully at the screen. This dosage here, she said softly. It conflicts with the allergy warning lower in her intake file. Dr. Levin adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. The room fell silent except for Lily's steady monitor rhythm and the distant squeak of wheels moving down the hallway outside. Richard's expression tightened slowly as the doctor reread the chart. Then Naomi saw it happen. The smallest shift in Dr. Levin's face. A pause. His jaw setting harder. Damn, he whispered under his breath before immediately correcting himself. He tapped the screen twice, eyes narrowing now. She is right. Ethan straightened instantly. What does that mean? Dr. Levin looked toward him carefully. It means your sister was prescribed medication that could have triggered a severe allergic response because her prior records were filed under a separate outpatient profile. Richard stood so fast the chair legs scraped sharply against the tile floor. How does something like that happen? His voice stayed controlled, but the fear beneath it made the room colder somehow. Dr. Levin remained calm. The emergency department is overloaded this morning. It was likely an intake synchronization issue between systems. Richard rubbed a trembling hand across his mouth while looking at Lily asleep beneath the blanket, unaware of how narrowly something terrible had just been avoided. Naomi quietly reached over and adjusted the oxygen tubing resting near Lily's cheek. Gentle, precise, like second nature. Ethan stared at Naomi now with none of the arrogance left from the morning, only confusion and guilt slowly taking shape behind his eyes. "You caught that?" he asked quietly. Naomi nodded once. "I saw the warning code didn't match the dosage chart." Ethan blinked. "Just by looking at it? Part of my job is noticing things before they become problems." The words landed harder than she intended. Silence stretched awkwardly after that. Rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows while overhead fluorescent lights reflected against polished floors. Like pale water. Somewhere down the corridor, an intercom announced a trauma team request in a flat mechanical voice. But inside the room, nobody moved for several long seconds. Richard finally looked directly at Naomi. Really looked at her this time. Not her scrubs. Not her skin color. Not the soaked woman standing on a sidewalk hours earlier. He looked at the steady calm in her posture, the tired circles beneath her eyes, the quiet competence in her hands. "You may have saved my daughter," he said carefully. Naomi shook her head lightly. "Dr. Levin handled it." "No," the doctor interrupted immediately while updating the chart corrections. "She caught it before I did." Richard's throat tightened visibly. The billionaire who had laughed beneath a hotel awning that morning now stood speechless beside a hospital bed, while the woman he dismissed had protected the person he loved most. Ethan lowered himself slowly into the chair beside Lily's bed and stared at the floor. Naomi could almost see the moment something cracked inside him. Not pride exactly. Something deeper. The dangerous illusion that money separated people into categories that mattered. Lily stirred faintly beneath the blanket, then opened her eyes halfway. "Is everybody okay?" she whispered sleepily. Naomi smiled softly and tucked the blanket closer around her shoulders. "Yeah, sweetheart," she said. "Everybody is okay." But Richard Whitmore kept staring at Naomi long after the words faded, because for the first time all day, he realized the woman standing in front of him had every reason to walk away from his family hours ago. And she had stayed anyway. The rain finally stopped just after noon, leaving the hospital windows streaked with pale gray water that caught the weak winter sunlight like cracked mirrors. Inside Mercy General, the emergency department settled into that strange exhausted calm that only came after chaos. Phones still rang. Intercoms still buzzed overhead. Nurses still hurried through corridors carrying charts and medication trays. But inside room 12 the air had softened. Lily Whitmore sat propped against her pillows, now wearing fuzzy hospital socks and slowly coloring a horse in her sketchbook with a purple marker Naomi had found at the pediatric desk downstairs. The oxygen tubing was gone. Some of the color had returned to her cheeks too. Small victories. The kind hospitals survived on. Naomi stood near the sink washing her hands carefully while warm water rushed over tired fingers still dry from sanitizer and winter air. She could feel Richard Whitmore watching her again from the chair beside Lily's bed, though now the silence between them carried something completely different than before. Not superiority. Hesitation. A man trying to figure out how to speak after realizing he had badly misjudged someone. Ethan remained near the window, unusually quiet, his expensive sneakers planted awkwardly against the polished tile floor while downtown traffic crawled far below. Every once in a while his eyes drifted toward Naomi before darting away again. Guilt had settled into him hard. It showed in the way he no longer filled silence with jokes. Dr. Levin stepped back into the room holding updated test results and a fresh cup of burnt cafeteria coffee. "Good news," he said with a tired smile. "The imaging came back clean. No immediate surgical concerns." Richard exhaled slowly, shoulders finally lowering for the first time all day. Lily looked up immediately. "Does that mean I can go home?" "Not today," Dr. Levin answered gently. "But soon." Lily groaned softly and dropped her head back against the pillow while Naomi smiled despite herself. "You are going to survive one more night of hospital food," she teased quietly. Lily pointed her marker dramatically. "Barely." The room laughed then. Even Ethan. Small. Nervous. But real. The sound faded quickly afterward, leaving behind a warmth that felt almost fragile. Richard stood slowly and crossed toward Naomi near the counter. Up close, exhaustion showed more clearly on him now. The silver at his temples. The faint crease beneath his eyes. The stiffness in his posture like stress had lived inside his shoulders for years. "Miss Carter," he said carefully. Naomi looked up from drying her hands. "Naomi is fine." He nodded once. "Naomi." The word sounded unfamiliar coming from him, quieter than before. "I owe you an apology." Ethan shifted uncomfortably near the window. Naomi remained still. Richard glanced briefly toward Lily to make sure she was distracted with her coloring book before continuing. "This morning outside the hotel, the way my son behaved." He stopped there, jaw tightening slightly. "The way I behaved was unacceptable." Naomi studied him silently while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city. Hospitals taught people strange things about honesty. Fear stripped away performance faster than almost anything else. Richard Whitmore no longer sounded like a billionaire protecting his image. He sounded like a father who had spent hours sitting beside his daughter wondering how close he came to losing her. "You do not owe me anything," Naomi said softly after a moment. Richard shook his head immediately. "No, I do." Ethan finally stepped away from the window then, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. "I am sorry too," he muttered quietly without fully lifting his eyes. Naomi looked at him carefully. Beneath the expensive clothes and spoiled confidence, he suddenly seemed painfully young. 17. Old enough to imitate cruelty, young enough to still unlearn it. "Lily needed you today," Naomi said calmly. "That matters more." Ethan swallowed hard but said nothing. The silence afterward stretched warm and uncomfortable at the same time. Then Lily suddenly held up her sketchbook toward Naomi from the bed. "Do you think the horse looks okay?" Naomi walked over and crouched beside her with a soft smile. "I think," she said gently, "that horse looks like it survived a storm." And for reasons none of them could fully explain, Richard Whitmore felt those words settle deep into his chest like they were meant for far more than the drawing. By late evening, Mercy General had settled into its nighttime rhythm, the kind Naomi Carter knew by heart. The overhead lights dimmed slightly in the family waiting areas. The hallways quieted except for distant monitor alarms and the occasional squeak of rubber soles against polished tile. Outside the windows, Charlotte glowed beneath damp streets and reflections from traffic lights smeared across rain-dark pavement like watercolor streaks. Inside room 12, Lily Whitmore had finally fallen asleep with her sketchbook resting crookedly across her lap, one purple marker still loosely curled between her fingers. Naomi gently lifted the marker before it slipped onto the floor, and placed the sketchbook carefully on the bedside table beside a half-finished cup of apple juice. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm blankets fresh from the linen cart downstairs. Richard sat near the bed in silence, jacket removed, tie loosened now. He looked older tonight than he had that morning beneath the hotel awning. Not physically older exactly, just worn thinner somehow. Like the day had peeled away layers he usually kept polished and hidden beneath expensive suits and rehearsed confidence. Ethan had disappeared nearly an hour earlier after quietly telling Lily he would bring back her favorite strawberry candies from the hospital gift shop. Naomi suspected he mostly needed air. Shame could make people restless. She adjusted Lily's foreline carefully while checking the monitor readings one more time. Stable heart rate. Oxygen normal. Breathing calm. Good. Richard watched her hands for a moment before speaking softly into the dim room. "How long have you been doing this?" Naomi glanced up. "Nursing." He nodded. "Almost 8 years. You are good at it." Naomi gave a tired half-smile while securing the blanket near Lily's shoulder. "Most days I am just trying not to fall behind." Richard looked down briefly at his folded hands. Still. Silence settled again afterward, gentle this time instead of strained. Rainwater still clung to the corners of the hospital windows, catching the faint city lights outside like silver veins. Somewhere down the hall, a patient laughed weakly at something a nurse said, followed by the soft rolling sound of a medication cart moving across tile. Naomi reached for Lily's chart when Richard spoke again, quieter now. "My wife used to volunteer in pediatric wards." Naomi paused. Richard's eyes remained fixed on his sleeping daughter. Before she died, she spent more time in hospitals than I did. She used to tell me you could judge people by how they treated nurses and janitors, because those were the people holding everything together when nobody important was watching. Naomi said nothing. Richard let out a slow breath through his nose. I used to think she was exaggerating. The words hung there beneath the soft machine beeps. Honest. Uncomfortable. Naomi leaned lightly against the counter near the sink, exhaustion settling deeper into her legs now that the adrenaline of the day had faded. People forget hospitals are human places, she said softly. Fear makes them act differently. Richard looked toward her. Is that what happened to me this morning? Naomi held his gaze for a moment. She could still remember the dirty rainwater soaking through her scrubs. Ethan laughing. Richard smiling beneath the hotel awning while strangers stared. The memory remained sharp, but strangely it no longer carried the same anger. Mostly disappointment now. I think, she answered carefully. Sometimes people get so comfortable being protected by money that they stop noticing when they hurt somebody. Richard lowered his eyes immediately. The truth in her voice landed heavier than accusation would have. The room stayed quiet after that until the door creaked open softly and Ethan stepped back inside carrying a small paper gift bag from downstairs. His hoodie was damp again from stepping outside briefly, cool night air following him into the warm hospital room. He stopped when he noticed the silence between Naomi and his father. Did I miss something? He asked awkwardly. Richard looked at his son for a long moment before answering. Yeah, he said quietly. I think maybe we both did. Ethan frowned slightly, confused by the weight behind the words, while Naomi turned back toward Lily's monitor beneath the dim amber lights. Outside the hospital windows, downtown Charlotte shimmered quietly after the storm, and for the first time all day, the Whitmore family sat together without pretending they were untouched by the people around them. Just after midnight, Mercy General became quieter in the way only hospitals could. Not silent. Never silent. Machines still pulsed softly behind half-closed doors. Elevators chimed in distant hallways. Nurses exchanged tired updates beneath muted fluorescent lights, while the scent of coffee drifted through the overnight corridors like survival itself. But the frantic energy from earlier had faded, replaced by something slower and more honest. Naomi sat alone for a moment at the nurse's station reviewing patient charts beneath the pale glow of a desk lamp, while rainwater still glimmered faintly across the parking garage outside. Her shoulders ached now. Deep tiredness settled into her bones after nearly 16 hours awake, but she kept working steadily, one chart at a time. Across the small television mounted in the corner of the waiting area, a local news anchor spoke softly about rising flood conditions downtown after the storm. The volume remained low, barely noticeable beneath the hum of hospital ventilation. Then Sandra suddenly looked up from her tablet across the desk. Naomi, she said slowly. I think that is you. Naomi frowned slightly and turned toward the screen. The anchor had disappeared now, replaced by shaky vertical cell phone footage filmed beneath gray morning rain outside the Whitmore Grand Hotel. The image zoomed shakily toward a woman in blue scrubs standing beside the curb while dirty street water exploded across her clothes from a passing Lamborghini. Naomi felt her stomach tighten instantly. Around the nurse's station, two orderlies stopped walking. A respiratory therapist lowered her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Ethan's laughter echoed faintly from the television speakers. Then Richard Whitmore stepped into frame smiling beneath the hotel awning while extending money toward Naomi like the entire thing was entertainment. Sandra whispered softly beneath her breath. Oh my God. Naomi immediately reached for the remote sitting beside the printer and muted the television completely. But it was too late. Everyone had already seen enough. The caption beneath the video read, Billionaire developer and son face backlash after viral rain incident. Naomi stared at the frozen image of herself on the screen for one long uncomfortable second before looking away. Heat crawled slowly up the back of her neck. She hated this feeling. Not anger. Exposure. Hospitals made privacy feel sacred. And suddenly her worst moment from the morning was spreading through the city like gossip wrapped in outrage. Are you okay? Sandra asked carefully. Naomi nodded automatically even though she was not completely sure. It is nothing. But it was not nothing. Thousands of strangers online were already turning her humiliation into headlines and comments and arguments between people who knew absolutely nothing about her. One orderly quietly muttered, "That rich guy is done for." Naomi did not answer. Before anyone could say more, the elevator doors opened down the hall and Ethan Whitmore stepped out carrying 2 vending machine sodas. He froze almost immediately when he noticed every eye near the nurse's station shifting toward him. Confusion crossed his face first, then realization. Slowly, he turned toward the muted television mounted in the corner. The frozen frame still showed his father smiling beneath the awning while Naomi stood soaked in rainwater beside the curb. Ethan's expression drained completely. The soda can slipped slightly in his grip with a metallic crackle. Nobody spoke. The silence hurt worse than yelling would have. Ethan looked toward Naomi standing beside the desk under the fluorescent lights. "I did not know somebody recorded it," he said quietly. Naomi crossed her arms lightly, exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body now. "People record everything." Ethan glanced back at the screen where thousands of strangers were probably tearing him apart already online. For the first time in his life, public embarrassment had reached him too. Not as a joke. Not as entertainment. As consequence. Richard stepped out of Lily's room a second later and instantly noticed the tension in the hallway. His eyes moved toward the television, then stopped. Naomi watched the exact moment his face changed. The billionaire developer who spent years controlling headlines suddenly stood motionless beneath hospital lights, while his worst moment replayed silently in front of nurses and strangers. He looked at Naomi afterward, not defensive this time. Not angry. Just tired. Deeply tired. "How bad is it?" he asked quietly. Sandra hesitated before answering. "About 4 million views in 6 hours. Richard closed his eyes briefly like the number physically hurt. But Naomi kept watching him carefully because something else hurt more than the headlines ever could. He looked ashamed not because people saw what happened. He looked ashamed because for the first time he truly saw it too. The hospital cafeteria smelled like burnt coffee, buttered toast, and exhaustion. At nearly 2 in the morning, only a handful of people remained scattered beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. An elderly man sleeping upright near the vending machines, 2 paramedics quietly eating fries at the far table, and Naomi Carter sitting alone beside the window with a paper cup of soup slowly cooling untouched in front of her. Outside, the rain had finally stopped completely. The parking lot shimmered beneath orange streetlights, every puddle reflecting the city like broken glass. Naomi rubbed tired fingers against her temple while staring down at her silent phone resting beside the soup cup. Notifications kept appearing every few seconds. Friends, coworkers, old classmates she had not spoken to in years. Everybody had seen the video now. She hated that. Not because she cared what strangers thought, but because public sympathy always came tangled with curiosity. People wanted stories, explanations, anger. But Naomi had spent most of her life learning how to survive humiliation quietly. The scraping sound of a chair pulling back across tile interrupted her thoughts. Ethan Whitmore sat down across from her holding 2 coffees from the vending machine kiosk. He looked exhausted. The expensive confidence he wore that morning seemed completely gone now, replaced by something raw and uncertain. He slid 1 coffee toward her carefully. "It is terrible," he admitted softly before she could speak. Naomi glanced at the cup but did not touch it. "Which part?" Ethan swallowed hard. "All of it." Silence settled between them while a microwave hummed somewhere behind the serving counter. Ethan stared down into his own coffee for a long moment before speaking again. "People online are calling me a racist." Naomi studied him quietly. "And what do you think?" Ethan looked up immediately, almost startled by the question. The fluorescent lights above made him look younger somehow, less polished. "I do not know," he admitted after a long pause. "I never thought about it before." Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. "That is usually how it works." Ethan frowned faintly. "I did not splash you because you are black. Maybe not consciously." The words were calm, not angry. Somehow that made them hit harder. Ethan looked away toward the dark cafeteria windows. Naomi watched him carefully. She had met boys like Ethan before. Kids raised inside wealth so complete it insulated them from consequence. They learned early that mistakes disappeared if you had enough money, enough charm, enough people cleaning up after you. But tonight the internet had done something unfamiliar to Ethan Whitmore. It forced him to sit still inside the discomfort instead of escaping it. You laughed, Naomi said softly. Your father laughed too. Not because you hated me personally. Because somewhere deep down, you both thought my humiliation was small enough not to matter. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. The truth sat heavy between them beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights. I am sorry, he whispered again, but this time the words sounded less rehearsed, less automatic. Naomi finally wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup he had brought her. The heat soaked slowly into her cold fingers. Do you know what bothered me most? She asked quietly. Ethan shook his head. It was not the water. He looked confused. Naomi stared out the cafeteria window where reflections from ambulance lights flickered softly across wet pavement. It was the way everybody around us expected me to accept it. Like being humiliated was just part of the price of existing in somebody else's world. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. A long silence followed. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he asked, Did people treat you like that a lot growing up? Naomi gave a tired smile without humor. Enough. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the answer without trying to argue against it. For the first time in his life, somebody was not yelling at him or canceling him online or humiliating him back. Somebody was simply telling him the truth, and somehow that felt far worse. Back upstairs, Richard Whitmore stood alone beside Lily's hospital bed, watching his sleeping daughter breathe beneath the dim amber lights while his phone vibrated endlessly with messages from lawyers, business partners, and public relations teams. He ignored every single one, because downstairs in a nearly empty cafeteria, his son was finally learning something no expensive school had ever managed to teach him. Compassion was not weakness. It was awareness. And once you truly saw another person's pain, pretending not to became impossible. At 4:30 in the morning, the city outside Mercy General looked washed clean. Rainwater still clung to the streets below, reflecting red traffic lights and the pale glow of early dawn beginning to creep between the buildings downtown. Inside the hospital, exhaustion hung over everything like fog. Nurses leaned against counters between patient rounds. Coffee machines hissed constantly. The overnight silence had given way to the slow, restless stirring that came before sunrise. Naomi stood near the medication room organizing charts with tired, steady hands, while the sleeves of her navy scrubs brushed softly against the metal counter. Her body begged for sleep now. Her eyes burned faintly from fluorescent lights and too many hours awake. But there was still another hour left in her shift. Across the hallway, Lily Whitmore was awake again, sitting cross-legged on her bed eating strawberry gelatin while Ethan sat beside her pretending not to notice she kept stealing his plastic spoon. You are taking giant bites on purpose, he muttered. Lily grinned weakly. You are just slow. Naomi heard the exchange while updating charts and smiled faintly to herself. Small sounds mattered in hospitals. Laughter meant breathing room. It meant fear had loosened its grip for a little while. Richard stepped out of the room quietly a moment later with his phone pressed against his ear, voice low and tense. Naomi tried not to overhear, but the hallway carried sound too easily at this hour. I do not care what the lawyers are recommending, he said sharply beneath his breath while pacing near the windows. No prepared statement. No excuses. And absolutely no blaming the media. He stopped walking then after noticing Naomi nearby. The tension in his shoulders shifted immediately. I will call you back, he muttered into the phone before ending the call. For a moment neither of them spoke. The hallway lights reflected softly across polished floors while a janitor pushed a mop bucket slowly past the far nurse's station. Naomi glanced toward the worker instinctively. An older Hispanic man she recognized from overnight shifts. Quiet, careful, mostly invisible to people rushing past him every day. Richard noticed the glance too. Then something strange happened. Without thinking about it, he stepped slightly aside to let the janitor pass first. The older man looked surprised enough to pause mid-step before nodding politely. Thank you, sir. Richard gave a small awkward nod back. Tiny moment. Barely noticeable. But Naomi saw it. Real change rarely arrived dramatically. Usually it appeared in small choices nobody else considered important. Richard leaned lightly against the wall afterward and exhaled slowly. My public relations team wants me to release a statement saying the video lacks context. Naomi looked at him carefully. Does it? He held her gaze for a long second before answering. No, the honesty in the word settled quietly between them. Richard rubbed tired fingers across his forehead. I spent 20 years building a reputation, he admitted softly. One stupid moment and suddenly everybody sees you differently. Naomi closed the chart folder in her hands. Maybe they just see more clearly now. Richard almost smiled at that, though sadness pulled at the corners of it. You really do not let people hide from themselves, do you? Naomi shrugged lightly. Hospitals do that already. I just work here. Down the hall, Lily suddenly called out from her room. Naomi, look. Naomi stepped inside to find Lily proudly holding up her sketchbook again. The horse drawing was finished now. Purple mane. Storm clouds in the background. But beside the horse stood a second figure holding an umbrella over it. Naomi smiled softly. Who is that? Lily glanced toward her father first before answering quietly. The person who stayed. Silence touched the room after that. Ethan looked down immediately. Richard stared at the drawing longer than anybody else. The warm monitor lights reflected faintly in his eyes while the first thin rays of sunrise crept slowly through the hospital windows behind them. Naomi adjusted Lily's blanket gently before turning toward the door to continue her shift. But just before she stepped into the hallway, Richard's voice stopped her. Naomi. She turned back. He swallowed once before speaking. When this is all over, I do not want my son remembering this as the day our family got embarrassed online. His voice lowered slightly. I want him to remember it as the day we learned how to be better. Naomi looked at Ethan standing quietly beside his sister's bed. Then at Lily holding the sketchbook against her chest. Finally she nodded once. Softly. Then start acting like it. The morning sun rose slowly over Charlotte like it was exhausted too. Thin gold light slipped through the tall hospital windows, stretching across polished floors and empty hallway chairs where families had spent sleepless nights waiting for good news. Mercy General smelled different in daylight. Less like emergency. More like coffee, clean linens, and quiet survival. Naomi Carter finally clocked out just after 7 in the morning. Her body felt heavy beneath her navy scrubs after nearly 18 straight hours awake. Every muscle in her back ached. Her eyes burned from fluorescent lights and too much emotional weight packed into one endless shift. She tied her curls back loosely while gathering her bag from the locker room, hoping for nothing more complicated than sleep and silence. But the moment she stepped into the hospital lobby, she stopped short. News vans lined the curb outside. Cameras. Reporters. Bright station logos reflected across the glass entrance doors while security guards struggled to keep the crowd back from the driveway. Naomi's stomach sank immediately. A television mounted near the reception desk replayed the viral video again, this time beside headlines discussing Richard Whitmore's collapsing public image. One business channel speculated about investors distancing themselves from his company. Another replayed footage of social media commentators criticizing wealthy entitlement and racial bias. Naomi lowered her eyes instantly and moved toward the side exit, hoping nobody would recognize her. Too late. That is her. The whisper came from somewhere near the reception desk. Then another voice. The nurse from the video. Naomi's chest tightened. She quickened her pace toward the employee hallway, but suddenly someone stepped into her path. Richard Whitmore. He looked like he had not slept at all. His tie hung loose around his collar. Dark circles shadowed his eyes beneath the harsh lobby lighting. Behind him, through the glass doors, reporters waited like wolves circling fresh noise. Naomi, he said carefully. Please. 1 minute. Naomi glanced toward the cameras outside. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. Richard nodded immediately. I know. For the first time since meeting him, his voice carried no control at all. No corporate confidence. No billionaire polish. Just exhaustion. Ethan stood a few feet behind him near the elevators, hands shoved awkwardly into his hoodie pockets. Even he looked overwhelmed now. My board wants me to deny everything, Richard admitted quietly. My lawyers want me to release a statement claiming the video was misleading. Naomi folded her arms tightly across her chest. And what do you want? Richard looked through the lobby windows toward the reporters outside, then back at her. I think I spent most of my life confusing reputation with character. The honesty in the sentence made Naomi pause. Richard stepped closer carefully, lowering his voice. I cannot erase what happened yesterday, but I also cannot let my daughter grow up watching me hide from it. Behind them, the elevator doors opened softly and Lily rolled into the lobby in a wheelchair pushed gently by Sandra from pediatrics. The young girl still looked tired but healthier now, wrapped in a pale yellow blanket with her sketchbook resting across her lap. Dad? She asked softly. Richard turned immediately. You should still be upstairs. Lily shrugged weakly. I wanted breakfast pancakes. Sandra smiled apologetically. She negotiated with 3 nurses and won. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath for the first time all morning. Lily's eyes shifted toward the crowd of cameras outside the hospital entrance. Why are there so many people? Nobody answered immediately. Then Lily looked toward Naomi standing near the side hallway and frowned slightly. Are they here because somebody was mean to her? The innocence in the question landed harder than any news headline could have. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Ethan stared down at the floor. Even Sandra looked away. Lily glanced between them, confused by the silence. Dad. Richard swallowed hard before crouching carefully beside his daughter's wheelchair. Yes, he admitted quietly. They are. Lily looked toward Naomi again. But she still helped me anyway. Naomi felt the entire lobby go still around those words. Even the reporters outside seemed quieter somehow behind the thick glass doors. Richard looked up slowly toward Naomi with something raw in his expression now. Shame, gratitude, regret, all tangled together. That, he said softly, almost to himself, is the part everybody needs to hear. The hospital lobby doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss, and immediately the noise outside rushed inward like a wave. Reporters shouted questions over one another. Camera shutters snapped rapidly beneath the bright morning sun reflecting off wet pavement. Security guards struggled to maintain a narrow path between the entrance and the curb where black SUVs waited with engines idling. Naomi instinctively stepped back toward the hallway, but Richard Whitmore remained still beside Lily's wheelchair. For a moment he simply stared through the glass at the crowd gathered outside. Investors were already calling him a liability online. News commentators were dissecting his parenting, his privilege, his silence. Yet somehow none of that seemed to weigh on him as heavily as the quiet sentence his daughter had spoken moments earlier. But she still helped me anyway. Lily shifted slightly beneath her yellow blanket and looked up at her father. Are we in trouble? Richard crouched beside her again carefully. No, sweetheart, he said softly. But I made a mistake. A big one. Lily frowned in the thoughtful, serious way children sometimes did when adults finally started telling the truth. Then say sorry. Ethan let out the faintest breath beside the elevators, almost like the simplicity of the answer hurt. Richard looked toward Naomi standing near the side hallway with her overnight bag hanging tiredly from one shoulder. She looked exhausted. Not dramatic exhaustion. Real exhaustion. The kind that lived in the slow movement of her hands and the ache behind her eyes after caring for strangers all night, while the internet turned her humiliation into entertainment. Richard stood slowly. Would you come outside with us? Naomi blinked immediately. Absolutely not. He nodded once like he expected the answer. I understand. No, she said more firmly. You do not. The lobby quieted around them. Even the reporters outside seemed distant behind the glass now. Naomi crossed her arms tightly. I spent my entire life learning how to survive people staring at me for the wrong reasons. I am not walking out there so your company can repair its image using my face. The words landed clean and sharp. Richard absorbed them without arguing. You are right, he admitted quietly. That is not fair to ask of you. Ethan looked at Naomi, then at his father. Dad! Richard lifted one hand slightly, stopping him. For once he was not trying to defend himself. Naomi studied him carefully. 24 hours earlier he would have hidden behind lawyers and public statements polished by corporate teams. Now he just looked tired enough to finally tell the truth. Richard glanced down at Lily before speaking again. Then let me do this alone. Naomi's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained guarded. Richard turned toward the glass entrance doors where microphones and cameras waited outside in the morning sunlight. He paused only once before reaching for the handle. "Dad," Ethan called quietly. Richard looked back. Ethan swallowed hard. Beneath the weight of everything that had happened since the storm. "Do not lie this time." The sentence hit the lobby harder than shouting would have. Richard held his son's gaze for a long moment before nodding once. Then he stepped outside. The noise exploded instantly. Questions fired from every direction. "Mr. Whitmore, do you deny the allegations? Was the incident racially motivated? Has your company lost investors?" Flashbulbs reflected sharply against the wet sidewalk. Richard stopped beneath the hospital awning exactly where the cameras could see him clearly. No sunglasses. No prepared statement in his hands. Just exhaustion and honesty beneath the Carolina sunlight. Inside the lobby, Naomi stood motionless near the hallway, while Lily watched through the glass with wide, curious eyes. Ethan remained beside his sister, unusually still. Outside, Richard raised one hand slowly, asking for silence. Amazingly, the crowd gave it to him. His voice carried through the microphone, steady but stripped clean of performance. "Yesterday morning," he said, "my son and I humiliated a woman who had done absolutely nothing to deserve it." Naomi lowered her eyes immediately. The lobby behind her felt frozen. Richard continued anyway. "And hours later, that same woman helped save my daughter's life." Even the reporters stopped interrupting now. Richard glanced once back toward the hospital entrance where Naomi stood partially hidden beyond the glass. "People online want to know whether I am sorry because my reputation suffered. The answer is no." His throat tightened slightly. "I am sorry because for one terrible moment, I forgot another human being deserved dignity whether she had money or not." Inside the lobby, Ethan stared at his father in complete silence while Lily slowly reached for Naomi's hand beside her wheelchair. Naomi looked down, surprised, before gently holding the little girl's fingers back beneath the warm hospital light. The crowd outside Mercy General had gone strangely quiet by the time Richard Whitmore finished speaking. Cameras still pointed toward him beneath the hospital awning. Reporters still held microphones tightly against expensive coats, while morning wind moved damp strands of hair across their faces. But the aggressive noise from earlier had faded. No one expected honesty, especially not from a billionaire standing in the middle of a public scandal. Richard lowered the microphone slowly after answering a final question about accountability. His voice had remained calm the entire time, though Naomi could see exhaustion pressing against every line of his face through the hospital glass. He looked less like a powerful businessman now and more like a man finally stripped down to something real. Inside the lobby, Lily still held Naomi's hand loosely beside the wheelchair. "Do you think Daddy is sad?" she asked softly. Naomi glanced toward Richard standing alone beneath dozens of cameras outside. "I think," she answered carefully, "your dad is learning." Lily considered that seriously before nodding once, like children often did when they sensed adults were trying hard to become honest. Ethan stood a few feet away near the elevators with his hands shoved into his hoodie pockets again. He had not looked at his phone once since the press conference started. Not even when notifications continued buzzing endlessly in his pocket. For the first time in years, the opinion that mattered most to him was standing right in front of him instead of online. The hospital doors slid open moments later, and Richard stepped back inside carrying cold morning air with him. Flashbulbs still burst outside behind the glass, but the noise sounded farther away now. He looked directly at Naomi first. "Thank you," he said quietly. Naomi frowned faintly. "For what?" Richard glanced toward Lily. "For reminding my family what dignity looks like." The sentence landed softly in the warm hospital lobby. No performance. No cameras close enough to reward him for saying it. Just truth. Sandra approached from the pediatric wing carrying discharge paperwork and a tired smile. "Good news," she announced gently. "Miss Whitmore gets to go home this afternoon if her vitals stay stable." Lily raised both arms weakly in victory from the wheelchair. "Finally." Ethan laughed under his breath while Richard closed his eyes briefly with relief. Naomi smiled too before instinctively checking the monitor clipped near Lily's finger one more time. Still steady. Still safe. A volunteer rolled a breakfast cart through the lobby then, filling the air with the smell of syrup and warm biscuits. Somewhere nearby, a little boy laughed while chasing his mother across the waiting area chairs. Life inside the hospital moved forward the way it always did, quietly carrying people through their worst moments whether they were rich or poor. Richard looked toward Naomi again after a long silence. "My company sponsors several scholarship programs," he said carefully. Naomi's expression changed immediately. "Do not." He stopped. "I was not trying to buy forgiveness." "Maybe not," she answered softly. "But money is still the first language you reach for." Richard absorbed the truth without arguing. Ethan lowered his eyes beside him. Naomi adjusted the strap of her overnight bag higher onto her shoulder. "What happened yesterday mattered because it was human," she continued calmly. "Not because it became public." Richard nodded slowly. "You are right." The simplicity of the answer surprised even Ethan. No defense. No negotiation. Just acceptance. Lily tugged lightly on Naomi's sleeve, then held up the sketchbook from earlier. "I finished it." Naomi looked down at the final drawing. The purple horse now stood beneath clear skies instead of storm clouds. Beside it were 4 figures under the same umbrella. A small girl, a tall man, a teenage boy, and a woman in blue scrubs. Naomi's throat tightened unexpectedly. "That is beautiful," she whispered. Lily smiled proudly. "Nobody is standing alone anymore." Silence drifted softly through the lobby after that. Even Richard looked away briefly, emotion flickering across his face too quickly for him to hide it completely. Naomi crouched beside Lily carefully despite the ache in her exhausted legs. "You know," she said gently, "storms do not last forever." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "But people remember who stayed during them." Naomi blinked once at the words. Then slowly, despite everything that had happened between them, she looked up at Richard and Ethan standing beside the wheelchair. For the first time since the rainstorm outside the hotel, the distance between them no longer felt impossible. Not erased. Just human. 3 weeks later, the rain returned to Charlotte in a soft, steady drizzle that painted the streets silver beneath the evening lights downtown. Buses hissed along wet curbs. Neon signs reflected across puddles outside corner diners and office towers, while people hurried beneath umbrellas through the cold November air. Naomi Carter stepped out of Mercy General just after sunset, exhaustion settling gently into her shoulders after another long shift in pediatrics. Her navy scrubs smelled faintly of antiseptic and baby powder, and the warm pressure marks from her hospital badge still rested against the back of her neck. She paused beneath the hospital awning for a moment, listening to the rain tap softly against the concrete outside. Strange how storms sounded different now. Less lonely somehow. Across the street, a city bus pulled away from the curb with a long sigh of air brakes, leaving behind a spray of mist beneath the glowing traffic lights. Naomi adjusted the strap of her bag and prepared to step into the rain when headlights slowed beside the curb. A black SUV stopped quietly nearby. Not flashy. No reporters. No cameras. Just soft windshield wipers moving back and forth beneath the drizzle. The passenger door opened, and Ethan Whitmore stepped out holding an umbrella. He looked different now. Still dressed well. Still unmistakably privileged. But the sharp, careless arrogance he wore that morning outside the hotel had disappeared. In its place stood something quieter. More aware. "Hey!" he said awkwardly over the rain. Naomi blinked once, surprised. "Hey!" Ethan walked closer and lifted the umbrella slightly over both of them without speaking for a moment. Rain whispered softly against the black fabric overhead, while traffic lights reflected gold across the wet sidewalk beneath their feet. "Lily made me come," he admitted finally with the faintest smile. Naomi laughed softly despite herself. "That sounds about right." Ethan shoved one hand into his coat pocket nervously. "She keeps showing everybody that drawing. From the hospital." Naomi smiled at the memory instantly. The purple horse. The umbrella. Nobody standing alone anymore. "How is she?" "Better," Ethan answered quietly. "Actually better." He glanced down at the rainwater gathering near the curb. "Dad too, I think." Naomi studied him carefully beneath the soft city lights. "And you?" Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose. "Working on it." Honesty sounded strange on him at first. But real. Naomi nodded once. Around them, downtown Charlotte moved on with its evening rhythm. Horns in the distance. Shoes splashing through puddles. The smell of coffee drifting from a shop across the street. Normal life continuing quietly after everything dramatic had already passed. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket, then pulled out a folded piece of paper. Lily wanted you to have this. Naomi unfolded it carefully beneath the umbrella. Another drawing. This time the storm clouds were gone completely. The horse stood beneath clear skies near a bus stop while sunlight broke through the background in yellow crayon streaks. At the bottom, written in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for staying kind." Naomi stared at the drawing for a long silent moment while rainwater shimmered along the edge of the sidewalk beside them. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. Ethan watched her carefully. "You know," he said softly, "before all this happened, I used to think being a good person mostly meant not doing terrible things." Naomi looked up slowly. Ethan gave a small embarrassed laugh. "Turns out that is a pretty low bar." Naomi smiled faintly beneath the umbrella. "Most important lessons are uncomfortable." Ethan nodded once. Then, after a long pause, he glanced toward the hospital behind her. "I applied to volunteer here," he admitted quietly. Naomi raised an eyebrow slightly. "At a hospital?" "Yeah." He shrugged awkwardly. "Apparently they need people to restock blankets overnight." Naomi laughed softly again, warmer this time. "Glamorous." "I know." Rain continued falling gently around them while traffic rolled through the city beyond the glow of streetlights and wet pavement. For a moment neither of them spoke. They simply stood there beneath the umbrella, listening to the steady rhythm of water against concrete and distant ambulance sirens fading somewhere downtown. Then Naomi carefully folded Lily's drawing and slipped it into her bag beside her scrubs. "You know," she said quietly while looking out toward the rain, "money can fix a lot of things." Ethan nodded. "Yeah." Naomi glanced toward him beneath the soft amber streetlight glow. "But kindness fixes people." Ethan swallowed hard and lowered his eyes briefly. The rain kept falling softly around them, washing the city clean one street at a time while somewhere far behind hospital windows, a little girl slept peacefully knowing the people she loved had finally learned how to see others clearly. And standing there beneath a shared umbrella on a quiet Charlotte sidewalk, Naomi Carter realized something too. She had not changed the whole world, but she had changed one family. And sometimes that was enough.